So here's one of the perks of doing the opening remarks. I get to introduce a fabulous lady who I've admired for a very long time. And before I leave you, therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce our event patron, the Honourable Mrs. Anson Chan. In her nearly 40 years of service, Mrs. Chan has played a prominent role in the campaign for full universal suffrage for election of Hong Kong's chief executive and all members of the legislature. She is the convener of Hong Kong 2020, a democracy and governance issues think tank, and a founding director of Project Citizens Foundation Limited. In October 2017, she was named the 4th recipient of the O'Connor Justice Prize, which recognizes those who have made extraordinary efforts to advance the rule of law, justice, and human rights, joining previous recipients such as the former US President Jimmy Carter for her work advancing social justice in the city. It is my honor to welcome Mrs. Chan on stage.
Thank you, Ms. Kocha, for your very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming on this very wet Tuesday afternoon. The Chinese have a saying that when important people travel, the rain accompanies them. And you are all clearly very important people. Why? Because each and every one of us in this room has a role to play in stopping modern slavery. And it goes without saying that Hong Kong has to play its part in this ongoing global battle. We have to be both vigilant as a community to keep our own house in order, and we must be constantly mindful of our obligations under our own Bill of Rights and the various international treaties that we are signatory to or which have been applied to us by our sovereign government. It's very easy for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in societies that are fundamentally free and governed by the rule of law to become complacent. I constantly encounter looks of amazement from acquaintances who simply cannot believe that in modern-day Hong Kong, human trafficking and forced labor are an issue. The fact is that human slavery is a global dirty secret, and no jurisdiction, however well governed, can put its hand on its heart and assert that it has driven out such practices entirely. On the contrary, there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that the problem is still on the increase worldwide. According to the 2017 Modern Slavery Index compiled by a British analytics firm, modern slavery risks have risen in nearly 3/4 of the 28 member states of the European Union over the previous year, in significant part due to waves of migration into the EU from Syria and other war-torn countries. This is borne out by a report by the Council of Europe's Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, or GRETA for short. Published earlier this year, the report states that the number of identified victims of labor trafficking has not only increased, but in some countries, including Belgium, Cyprus, Georgia, Portugal, Serbia, and the United Kingdom, has overtaken sex trafficking as the primary form of human trafficking. Most victims of labor exploitation, one of the most challenging aspects of modern-day slavery, according to GRETA, are male victims working in sectors such as agriculture, hospitality, and fisheries. Female victims are most likely to work in domestic or care work and fall prey to both labor and sexual exploitation. Migrant workers are particularly at risk of exploitation, according to the report, which also points to recruitment via the internet and social media as a growing trend. Each year, the United States Department of State publishes its Trafficking in Persons report, an extremely comprehensive scorecard of progress on combating trafficking worldwide. In all, the report analyzes the situation in some 190 countries in terms of their performance in prosecution, protection, and prevention. This year's report acknowledges that, and I quote, "The government of Hong Kong demonstrated significant efforts during the reporting period by releasing an action plan to combat trafficking and enhance protections for foreign domestic workers by establishing a central steering committee to coordinate anti-trafficking efforts, passing legislation that strengthened the penalties against employment agencies that violate certain labor provisions, increasing the number of investigations for sex trafficking-related offenses, and training a large number of frontline officers on victim identification and investigative methods." Having acknowledged this progress, however, the report goes on to express the view that during the period under report, the Hong Kong SAR government did not demonstrate increasing efforts compared to the previous reporting period. An important criteria when considering whether enough has been done to warrant upgrading Hong Kong from its current status on the Tier 2 watch list, just one rank up from the lowest Tier 3. In particular, the report noted that fewer convictions for sex trafficking-related offenses were reported, that sentences were deemed insufficiently stringent for the seriousness of the crime, and some law enforcement officers did not properly investigate incidents with clear trafficking indications reported to them by NGOs. A similarly uncomplimentary view is taken by the authors of the Global Slavery Index, which has estimated that there are more than 10,000 persons living in modern slavery in Hong Kong. It gives the city no more than a CC grading, reflecting a limited overall response which relies largely on basic victim support and falls short in aspects such as the criminal justice framework, coordination and collaboration mechanisms, and protection for those vulnerable to modern slavery. Whatever one's personal feelings about the fairness of these assessments, they clearly do not reflect well on our aspiration to be Asia's world city. When it comes to issues of human rights, our administration should strive its hardest to place itself beyond international reproach. Hong Kong should not be languishing under such fundamentally shameful performance assessments. The government must respond to criticisms and not repeatedly fall back on protestations that the present legislative framework, albeit bolstered by the recently initiated action plan, is adequate. The United States State Department report recommends strongly that Hong Kong enact a comprehensive anti-trafficking law that criminalizes all forms of trafficking, including sex trafficking and forced labor, without transborder movement, in accordance with the definitions set forth in the 2000 United Nations Trafficking in Persons Protocol. In the meantime, it sets out a lengthy list of areas that it considers merit immediate attention, including increasing efforts to proactively identify sex and labor trafficking victims amongst vulnerable populations, such as mainland Chinese and foreign migrants, domestic workers, and women and children in prostitution, and refer them to protection services. Vigorously prosecuting suspected labor traffickers and recruiters, especially those who exploit foreign domestic workers, increasing legal protections and protective services for populations vulnerable to trafficking, enforcing new penalties to penalize employment agencies that charge excessive fees to vulnerable populations, especially foreign domestic workers, and enhancing public awareness campaigns and training to educate police, labor inspectors, prosecutors, judges, and the public on human trafficking as defined by international standards. Given that Hong Kong now hosts a population of over 300,000 foreign domestic helpers, this is a group which, as the report points out, merits particular attention. As I observed last year, Hong Kong was one of the first jurisdictions in Asia to protect migrant domestic workers by means of a formal employment contract, guaranteed minimum wage and employment visa, administered respectively by the Labor and Immigration Departments and monitored by the relevant overseas consulates. However, because helpers are required by law to live with the family they are working for, in practice, there is no real oversight of their actual working conditions. Many work very long hours and often have to share a room or live in a small partitioned area, meaning that they have little personal privacy. Prospective employers are required to state in the applications for a contract what the duties of the helper will be and what living space and other facilities will be available to them. In practice, how often are random inspections carried out by labor or immigration staff to determine whether the actual situation on the ground is as set down in the contract? Legislation is only as effective as the determination and ability to enforce it. Many helpers are either ignorant of their rights or reluctant to bring grievances to the attention of the authorities because they are frightened of losing their job and having to return to their home country within 2 weeks. Given that foreign domestic labor is such an integral component of Hong Kong's social and economic infrastructure, the government must be prepared to invest in the legal, administrative, and enforcement tools necessary to protect these vulnerable members of our society. With this in mind, I am delighted to see that my good friend and colleague Dennis Kwok, Legislative Council representative of the Legal Functional Constituency, will be delivering the closing remarks to this summit later this afternoon. Seriously concerned by the inadequacies in Hong Kong's current legislative framework, which he agrees fails to combat all forms of TIP as defined under the relevant international treaties, Dennis and his fellow LegCo colleague, Kenneth Leung, have initiated and overseen the drafting of a bill to update and enhance existing legislation, such as the Crimes Ordinance, and introduce new legislative provisions where necessary, such as maritime enforcement measures to tackle the trafficking of persons by sea. Dennis, Kenneth, and their colleagues on the Hong Kong Anti-Trafficking Concern Group are to be congratulated on their professional diligence and commitment to this complex task. And I urge all of you here today to lend your vigorous support to the bill's early consideration by the administration and the subsequent enactment by the Legislative Council. I am delighted once again to be associated with this fourth summit. And as usual, Kimberly and her team have done a first-class job in putting together the agenda and inviting so many distinguished speakers to this afternoon's summit. I commend the team particularly for focusing attention this year on the business perspective and on the crucial role of investors, business leaders, and board directors in breaking the chain of slavery operating in their own supply chain. I'm sure you're in for a very stimulating and interesting afternoon, and I hope that at the conclusion of today's summit, you will all go away with a much clearer idea of the role that each and every one of us can play in making this world a better place for all. Thank you very much.